Me and Marco and Richard. Hey guys, thanks so much for joining me. We've got a couple of topics today. The main one, though, is we're going to be talking a little bit about Tal Mitnik, who is this guy who's become written about quite a lot in the media recently. He's a conscientious objector against his service in the IDF, which he was drafted into, and he's been put in jail for 30 days for that. He did get out. And then he was, of course, drafted again and he refused, so he's gone back to jail. And he's become quite critical of the Israeli government. And he's been featuring a lot in the news, as I say. So we're going to talk a little bit about that to start off the show. So Alejandro, I'll come to you. What did you make about this story about Tal Mitnik?
Well, first of all, I think we should differentiate between his thoughts and the notion of the draft. I myself think I agree with Ayn Rand in the sense that the draft is a horrible political position. I think it shouldn't exist. And I think it's contradictory on itself. Do you think that if you're an Israeli, would you think that you would be safer if Tal was part of your army? Or would you feel worse and more worried? I think we should talk about that as we go forward. But the other thing is, would I agree with his arguments and thinking that the fight is over and that, as he mentions, more killing isn't appropriate or won't help anymore? I don't agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And Mark and Richard, what was your first impressions of the story about this guy?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is actually a personal story. This guy, if he weren't Israel in the first place, nobody would give a crap what he thinks or what he says. The only, and I understand this point because I was subject to draft. I think it was removed in Italy the year after I did it. And it is a kind of soul destroying thing that always looms over you when you're a kid. And I remember when people used to mention when I was younger, oh, when you grow up, you're gonna be a soldier. I used to hate the idea, but the issue is totally different. The guy is at war. He's in Israel. He's at war with Hamas. So any consideration I might have had are totally relevant to his case. But as I said, on the surface, is a kind of struggle, and it's clearly. I mean, the guy is 18-year-old. What does he really know? He is the product of a mixed economy, a product of the education in mixed economy, and he doesn't clearly have things clear in his mind. And some of the quotes that he uses are quite depressing. Actually, he says something like, "Oh, when I was at the military base for conscription, I was there with my peers." And their parents who were sending their children to probably risking their life. He's right, you're becoming a soldier, but that was a privilege that the parents or the victims at the Nova festival didn't have. They weren't allowed to have the last few minutes with the kids before they were killed by Hamas. So all these kind of things we have to bear in mind. And then, as Alejandro said, there is a whole situation about what are the general idea behind the draft itself, and there is the terrible exploitative use that the media are using. In his case, if you like, it's a sort of fallacy of composition, really. That they're making a generic point just according to what this guy said, that they make a whole bigger argument. And this whole exploitation of this poor kid's situation is just pathetic. By the way, thank you for making me read The Guardian again. It's soul destroying, honestly. Thank you very much.
You can blame Razzie for that.
I think in the course of this episode, we're probably going to talk quite a bit about what Tal himself has said. But that is only as a representative of the wider sense of his generation on that side of the argument, whether they're in Israel or whether they're the kind protesting in Western countries. So I do want to be careful to start with by making sure I'm not pillaring one particular individual who, as we've said, is already 18 and only 18 and whatever, and doesn't necessarily know much about the world. But as a representative of the wider culture and of the mistaken premises and the position that lots of young people are taking without thinking things through, then that is a hugely valid argument. So I think I might mention some of the quotes that he said, but only within that context of showing what wider people think. Because I think he's 18, but then isn't Greta Thunberg also 18, and there's quite a lot of similarities in how he's being presented by the media. He's the Greta of the situation. He's the victim who's standing up for victimhood, which puts him at the top of the pyramid of good in today's moral culture. And how long will it be before he's invited to address the UN or to say "how dare you" to a bunch of Western leaders in person? It feels like as a wider issue, that's who he's being set up to be. So that's my opening start.
Sure. So just to give people, I guess, a bit more information about him. So as you say, he's 18. He seems like to have been an intellectual young man, because when he's asked about how he came to the situation he's in, he kind of tells this story about kind of, I think, a teacher encouraging him to serve in basically military intelligence, and that he did some research on this when he was a teenager. And he found some stories about LGBT people in Gaza being blackmailed by Israeli forces into becoming informants. And he said that upon learning that, he learned that the system was built on oppression, and that this was something that kind of turned him against the Israeli government, right? That's the implication. And he's clearly, I think, leans towards the left. It's not maybe a main part of the story, but he used phrase kind of like the Israeli media is manufacturing consent for the war. Manufacturing consent is, of course, Chomsky's phrase. I don't know whether he's read Chomsky's book, but he seems to be coming from that kind of background, as a lot of precocious intellectual young teenagers probably would be. So that's the guy himself. And I guess, as you say, Richard, you don't really want to pick on this guy too much, because he's kind of being Joan of Arcified by the media for this, when there's any number of teenagers who probably could be in his situation and would do the same thing. But I found his story about being turned off about the Israeli intelligence service a bit strange, because he was learning that LGBT people were being blackmailed into being informants for the Israelis, and that's how he learned that the Israeli system was built on oppression. And presumably they're being blackmailed by whoever he's learning about. The Israeli intelligence officers saying, "We'll tell Hamas that you're gay, and they're gonna treat you very badly because of that." And of course, actually, what you would learn from that is that the Israeli intelligence service is making use of the fact that Hamas are oppressing gay people in Gaza. So that was just a strange part of that story. So some of the initial parts of it didn't make too much sense and weren't completely coherent, but that's kind of what he said. So
sorry, Morgan. I think the issue is that there are LGBT blah 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 people from Hamas who escape Hamas from Gaza, going to Israel, and Israel, in order to give them asylum, says, okay, you can stay here, but you have to be an informant for us. So it's not like Israel is oppressing gays all over the place. The people who attack Israel on a constant basis, who turn up to Israel and say, can you give me asylum? Well, what do you expect? Israel just opened the doors to everyone who says, identify as a bicycle or whatever. Obviously, comes with strings attached until you prove that you are a genuine refugee or somebody who really risked their life by staying in Gaza. We're not going to open the door for you. And if you do that, you have to prove yourself. So, I mean, that's no oppression. And as you said, it proves, first of all, that there are people in Gaza that try to escape the beautiful, lovely regime over there and the culture as a whole. And second, that Israel is a sanctuary for people like that. So all the excuses and the accusation from the various anti-Semitic parties are destroyed by an article of an unthinking journalist from the Guardian.
And when looking at LGBT, you've got to look at the fact that within Gaza itself, obviously, it's the culture there that's oppressing people who are LGBT in the first place. Now, in doing some research for this particular episode, I went one further than looking at The Guardian, and I had a look at an Al Jazeera article just to really push myself into anger. And that one was referring to the fact that many of the people who in Tal's position, who stand as conscientious objectors, start off in different kinds of protests, including pro-LGBT protests, pro-climate change protests, and just the sheer hypocrisy of Al Jazeera championing the fact that LGBT protests occur and therefore lead Israeli young people to go on and object to being drafted was just sickening, really.
And I guess we should start kind of by distinguishing that I think none of us here are going to agree with the draft at all. And I think, as Alejandro said, Rand writes quite eloquently about the draft in the context of Vietnam, condemning it quite thoroughly. I didn't know, Marco, that you had been subject to a draft. How long was that for?
Well, it's always been a year, I think. But you could declare yourself a conscientious objector and then effectively spend a year in a civilian setting, which I've done. But of course, my luck, the year after I did it, they removed it. So,
but it's still a compulsory year of your life that you have to give to society or the army. Society being the second, the most option. But yeah.
And I think that's probably kind of similar in Israel, as my understanding is, that you can you'll get drafted for the military, but it kind of can take various forms. Not that I'm saying that makes it okay anyway, but that it's not all kind of frontline service, that there's intelligence work kind of as is being implied here, or some other kind of administrative roles. But Rand, of course, is condemnative of the draft and the fact that it's the use of force by the government against citizens to do things which they don't want to do with their life. This isn't what's going to lead them to happiness. It's not going to be pursuant of their self-interest. And she writes really eloquently about how terrible it is to kind of force people into a military conflict which they don't agree with. So I think we should start by just making clear to people that the draft we're not criticizing him at all on the basis of being a draft dodger or something, or a coward or anything like that. I don't know if you guys have anything to say about the draft just before we go into some of the other things. Go on, Alejandro.
There are legitimate reasons to object the draft. I think that you should object the draft outright, and I think his reason why he's objecting against it's not something I'm very persuaded about. Still, I think he has the right to say no. But for instance, take a look. Imagine an Israeli who says, "Okay, I don't want to be a cannon fodder, so I'm not going as a soldier over there." I think that's completely legitimate, and I think it puts a point towards something that it's actually crucial today, where sometimes civilian population of the other side, Palestinians, are put above soldiers. I think saying, "Okay, I won't be part of this because they won't respect me and they won't treat my life as better," is something completely legitimate. I want to talk a bit more as well about the roots of why, as well, it's so silly to take this whole notion of the draft as such. But I don't know if Mark and Richard have something else to say.
Okay, carry on if you want.
Well, I think in one of the essays that Rand writes about what is capitalism, she presents the idea that values are objective. And with that, she means they aren't intrinsic. It's not a thing out there. But at the same time, they're not subjective. It's not the thing that is in you. Values are things that you identify in reality and act upon that. And if you don't have the conviction of doing that, then performing that action won't make it good. And as you can see with, for instance, someone like Tal going into the army, what good would it bring either to him or to the people that would be part of the army? I would say none. He wouldn't have any conviction to be a soldier. And at the same time, if you would want him to be defended by him, there wouldn't be any any benefit from that because he wouldn't have the conviction to do that. So that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's a bit weird that he makes a comment like it's not normal to live in constant fear of terrorist attacks. And so he's very well aware that Israel is on constant threat from one side or the other. And it's actually, people die because of missile and rocket attacks from the Palestinian side all the time. So I kind of question why would he not want to go and serve under the intelligence branch, which looks like it would have been eligible for. I know that the army doesn't allow you to select roles, but I'm sure you could have done something like that. And somebody said that you don't. You can also, on a religious ground, you can choose not to be drafted, or there's a mechanism that allows you to avoid it. But again, as Alejandro said, it comes down to values. My situation was totally different. Italy wasn't a war with anyone. Israel is on a constant war footing. At the moment, it's been attacked, so it's a retaliatory warfare that actually executing right now. So why wouldn't you want to go and be part of it, even on a what's it called? Combative role? It's his choice, but because in Israel society, actually not being in the army comes with a price to pay in terms of your role in society. It's such an embedded thing that then you're gonna find your life is gonna be much more restricted because you weren't in the army, which shouldn't be the case. But your values should be about freedom, should be about making your country a safer. Given that he's aware of the fact that you cannot be in constant fear, it means that you should be fighting in order to remove the fear, and that's what Israel is doing. He's fighting back in order to remove the constant threat.
I think when Rand was asked and was speaking about the draft, she was obviously speaking in the context of Vietnam. And a lot of what she said at the time that relates to that is relevant here if you translate the situation. But you've got to understand, of course, that the Vietnam was fighting a war on another territory that she herself recognized that the US shouldn't have got involved in the first place and was quite vocal against. But having got into it and having already been involved, then she was commenting on the draft during the time of war, that particular war. And she was asked whether one Q&A, whether people should be granted an amnesty. Those who were dodging the draft, to use the phrase, should be granted an amnesty. And she said that's not an appropriate question to ask in a time of war, because you can't promise amnesty to those who refuse to fight while others are going out to die. So the question really applies when you're not at war and establishing it as a principle that you wouldn't do. Because ideally what you want is a voluntary army. And let's be honest here, a lot of people have gone back to Israel on a voluntary basis to help defend the country because they know their principles are a risk from not doing so. And obviously that is the best way to tackle things. I think in what, as Marco was referring to there, Tal and people like him on his side of the argument are very fond also of the selectivity and omission in different settings. He was asked, for example, about his time in prison. He's been serving this 30-day prison sentence. He said it wasn't a fun experience, but it wasn't the worst in the world. It wasn't the worst imaginable. And then he went on to compare it instantly to the experience of Palestinian prisoners in the West Bank. And stopping there, not, of course, talking about hostages taken from Israel who are in prison in tunnels under the ground in Gaza. So it's very, all arguments are selectively geared towards saying Israel is the bad guy and omitting to mention what the Palestinians and Hamas have done on the other side.
For sure. And so there was a comment in the chat which was relevant, um, which Daniel's copping for me. So from Chana Etzner, I think, it said there is also an option for guys to do a national service job, as many religious girls do. I presume that's something like I don't know, community service or something like that, which maybe they can do as a kind of equivalent for their draft. So yeah, so I mean, so I think we've kind of established that we don't support the idea of a draft, and it's improper for him to have been drafted by the Israeli government. It's not a good thing. And to the kind of point that you and Alejandro were making, for example, in the Second World War, the French army is famously kind of mocked, especially in Britain, for having been ineffective and so on, and slandered as cheese-eating surrender monkeys. People say that kind of stuff. Whereas actually, I think when people who really know a lot about it will say things that the French military was very, very effective, but since they instituted a draft, like a huge percentage of the army was made up of people who didn't want to be there, who didn't have the appetite to be involved in the fight. And so therefore, that actually made a huge then contingent of the army ineffective. So if you're drafting people into the military, although there's a very important moral point there as well, it's also just completely ineffective a lot of the time. But then let's move on to some of the content of what Tal's saying. So the big kind of quote by him, which is emblazoned on the top of the article, which I sent out to you guys, is more killing won't bring back the lives of those who were lost on October 7th. Now, I don't know what you guys thought about that, but that struck me as a curious thing, because that's what he's criticizing the Israeli government for, or that's part of what he's saying in criticism of the Israeli government, and that's part of what he's criticizing people on the kind of Israeli right who are in favor of the Israeli government doing what it's doing. Because I don't think anyone suggested that it ever could bring them back. And I don't, although there's probably a national feeling of wanting revenge or justice in some way, I think there's also very clearly articulated a view that what needs to happen is the destruction of a threat, and that is the justification for the war. So I found it a bit strange when one of the first things that was brought up of him kind of justifying himself was that more killing won't bring back people's lives, and that there is no military solution to the conflict. I don't know what else stuck out to you guys, maybe, or if you thought anything about that.
I want to say about that it relies on a really bad confusion. You don't go, or you shouldn't go to war as revenge or in the aim of killing other people. You go to war to remove a threat. There's a hostile country that it's doing, like, putting your life in a threat, and many people in that country are supporting that. You go into the country and remove the threat in whatever way it's possible to you, and that's it. Yes, there can be a sentiment of revenge that can allow you to move yourself towards that. But it's whenever you conduct a war, you should be taking that as your core objective, and that's it. And thinking that, oh, people just want to be angry and kill a couple of guys because of what they did for a day. I think that's very, very, very wrong way of thinking about things.
Yeah, I think you're right there. It's a usual platitude that people who don't quite understand why this thing is happening. It's a usual mistake. It doesn't seem to. I mean, he's Israeli, so he must have heard about October the 7th. So what confuses him, I do not understand. Is that perhaps just the kind of political environment he moves in? Because it's quite obvious to me that if somebody attacks you, the job of your state, of your government, is to remove the threat, especially if, like in Israel, it's a continuous threat. So I don't see why you would say something like that. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And this is a point where I begin to wonder which are the words of the guy and which are the words of the actual Guardian writer, because the whole thing is a bit confused. Even the use of refuseniks. I mean, the word refuseniks was used to identify people who were refused by the Soviet Union to leave in order to, often Jews, in order to join Israel in the late 60s and 70s. So the sole undertone of this article is the usual Guardian bad Israel narrative. So again, it's hard to tell which one is the Guardian, which one is the kid, really.
And this is the way that people take phrases, and either single words like peace, for example, as a floating desire, an outcome without a cause, or a phrase such as "more killing won't bring back lost lives," which is true in itself as a statement isolated from any relevance to anything else. Whether it's your wife that was just murdered or in your home in London or not. The setting doesn't matter. One of the other things he said in the same vein is slaughter cannot solve slaughter. But of course, more appeasement will cost more, will cause more slaughter. More appeasement, more a capitulation to people like Hamas and those that hold them in power and support them will only cause more killing. But that's, again, the omitted part of the statement. That's the bit that's lost into the fog or deliberately turns his back on. And that's the problem with it. And of course, a lot of this comes out just like the kind of signs, like I mentioned, that Greta would hold in relation to the climate, signs like peace. I mean, there was a Eurovision skit a few years ago from Sweden when they were introducing the Eurovision Song Contest about what the perfect song was for the Eurovision Song Contest to win. And the lyrics for the perfect song they came up with were love, love, peace, peace. And the second verse was peace, peace, love, love. And that seems to have gone from being a comedy skit to being how people approach the world and the level of thinking they adopt towards it. I mean, it's like taking a Miss World acceptance speech from the 1970s as your government policy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good comparison, isn't it? So I guess, I mean, if it isn't obvious to people, he identifies himself as a pacifist. So he would be against any kind of violence per se, I guess. And I assume the comment, because it is a weird kind of non sequitur, the idea that it's not going to bring people back, and it is a kind of stock phrase that just people say. I guess it's a kind of rationalization for that position, because it's brought up in a context of refuting the opposing position to him, the position that is in favor of the Israeli government taking military intervention. And yet, of course, it's not genuinely refuting the case at all. He would have to say in some way that either Hamas isn't a threat, or he would have to say some way that it's going to be counterproductive, that it's going to cause more enmity to Israel. That would at least be kind of addressing the point, but it isn't at all. So that was something that was strange about it. Something that I thought was kind of interesting in the article was he cited people who have, let me just find the phrase. It was a Hebrew phrase for sobered up. And actually, I'm not even going to try and find it because I can't read it at all in the original. But it's this phenomena that supposedly in Israeli society that after October 7th of people have sobered up to the threat that Hamas represents, and it was brought up in a context of people having, as the Guardian put it, kind of moved to the right. So it mentioned that a lot of young people are much more right wing than their parents, and I wouldn't generally praise people for becoming more right wing, but probably what it's getting at is an idea of people being more self-assertive about their national self-interest. They want Israel to be protected. So probably the phenomena of people coming back and signing up to support Israel, either by joining the military or by donating money or doing any of this kind of stuff. I would assume it's that kind of phenomena that it's referring to. And I think that's quite interesting that that's what's happened. I don't know if you guys had any thoughts about it.
Well, I think, to be honest, it's just a consequence of people seeing what Hamas has published online themselves, live, while they were slaughtering Israelis. I mean, how many kids must have seen those videos? And how many kids must have been traumatized by what the people from Gaza and Hamas did on October the 7th? How can not that make you more right wing just because you want to fight back, right wing just because you want to defend your own country and go against the people who have proved themselves to be once again the aggressors, and all these civilians in Gaza who shoot RPGs and rocket launchers continuously right now as the IDF is moving down there. what do you expect? I mean, they are doing their own propaganda, and the Hamas people. They are radicalized Israeli. It's not radicalization. It's actually showing them what they're really up to.
And this sobering up concept seems ludicrous anyway, because the rockets have been continually fired from Gaza into Israel, a fact which Tal himself has acknowledged in other statements, whilst then dropping the fact later on. So it's not like you've suddenly become aware that the situation of having Gaza under Hamas control has not worked for the last 18 years. I mean, I think one of the things that I saw him interviewed over, one of his questions that a journalist asked him was about the phrase "from the river to the sea." And he did exactly the same thing here that he did in the other examples we're talking about. So he starts off by acknowledging that there are people that use that phrase that mean the genocide of Jews inside Israel. Okay? So if you acknowledge that fact, then that represents a serious threat. You can't just do peace with people who hold that view and expect it to work out, can you? But then he instantly drops that, because that's only a contractual obligation to mention it in passing before moving as quickly as possible on to your main point, which is that his point being that it's the oppression of Palestinians, that it's the Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea that people are fighting against. So, and of course, that's where all his emphasis and all his concentration of his argument is, that the Palestinians are the victims, whilst acknowledging very, very quickly in passing that the genocide of an entire people is the aim of a chunk, whatever size, that you want to do a deal with for peace.
Yes, and of course, the fact that he can understand that there's genocidal intent, at least on some level, by Hamas, or the fact that that is present in Hamas, is what puts the lie to his idea that there is no military solution to the conflict, which is something else that he's saying. But of course, in the short to medium term, that's the only solution that is present. Now, what else did you guys think about the way that he's being used? Because you mentioned, I think, Richard, you brought up before, Greta Thunberg, which I thought is a pretty good comparison, to be honest. And we seem to see these kind of Joan of Arc figures thrown up occasionally, being used rather cynically, I think, by either the media or by political wings. And of course, Greta is a kind of martyr for the environmentalist movement. And he, in this context, isn't really even being used as a martyr for pacifism. He's really just being a martyr for the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli cause. And I guess what's a real shame about it is he'll be used by them presumably, so long as it's going to generate publicity and headlines for this. But then as soon as either the conflict's ended or he stops being useful in that sense, he's going to be kind of cast aside. So this, poor kid is basically gotten himself into a situation where he's being thrown in jail. He's said some kind of silly things which are being reported internationally. And then also the people who are kind of his allies are going to drop him like a dead fish as soon as he's no longer useful. I don't know if you guys had any thoughts about the kind of cynical way he's being used.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's so much cynicism in all of this at the moment that it's everywhere, isn't it? You can compare him, for example, on one level to the so-called hot Houthi, the supposedly attractive Houthi rebel helping to attack ships in the Red Sea at the moment, who seems to have been all over social media because of his appearance, even though he's somebody who's advocating your death as a civilized person and his own death as somebody who wishes to be a martyr. But no, he's got nice cheekbones, so we'll go with that and stick him on the front page and present him as a perceptual ideal. I think when it comes to how he's being used, I'll go back to my Al Jazeera article, because all of this links together, really. Lots of this can start from somewhere like Al Jazeera, be picked up by somewhere like The Guardian, be repeated by some protesters of a similar young age in the streets of New York or London. Now, the Al Jazeera article was a classic because it linked together so many different things. It took him as the main piece, the main example. It cited a bunch of various conscientious objectors down the years, and including amnesty reports on those conscientious objectors and how terrible it was that they'd been put in prison repeatedly. It had the audacity to cite double jeopardy for the fact that people keep going back to prison for refusing again to go to war, like every month. Double jeopardy was being violated in the eyes of Al Jazeera. which is frankly ludicrous. And then, of course, it cited what is our classic example that they always like to cite, which is international law. And it referred to international law, Article 18, from the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which says that states must refrain from subjecting conscientious objectors to imprisonment and repeated punishment for failure to perform military service. So it's using all of the tools that the West concedes to all the time against it. And of course, Tal is an example of that. Look, we've got an Israeli who stands against what Israel is saying. Never mind all the Israeli soldiers who are going to war and do agree with Israel. They're irrelevant to the point that somebody like Al Jazeera, an organization like Al Jazeera and its followers is making. We're going to focus on this one guy and make his an example of the fact that they're all wrong. Not that being in the majority makes you right, but neither does being an exception make you wrong. And I think that's when people drop the context for when Rand is arguing for an independent man, for example. She's not arguing for you to be a lone wolf suicide bomber as an independent man. She's arguing to be independent on the right principles. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, they're clearly just using it in a very cynical way. If anything else, to show, oh, look, this guy is against it. Why couldn't anyone else be against it? And also his statement, I'm not supporting Hamas. I just want peace. It's like, well, then go to Gaza and start campaigning for peace, because they're the aggressors. So if you want peace, ask Hamas to stop the war now. And then they of course they pepper the whole article with the usual stolen concepts, the wrong definitions, the old occupation, the old apartheid, and all this kind of stuff. So it is. I mean, this poor kid, as you said, is just used as a temporary excuse to push more pro Hamas propaganda, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We can probably move on to the next topic. Anything else to say on this, Alejandro? No? Okay. I'll just read out the couple of super chats we've got. We've got £2 from Kathleen, who's said this is in sympathy for having to read The Guardian and so on. Thank you so much, Kathleen. And then $1.99 from Stephen Harper. Thank you as well. So our second story today is that Qatar's foreign ministry has announced that they are appalled about irresponsible comments which have been made by Benjamin Netanyahu, or more specifically, have been leaked, recorded conversation that he had, which were leaked from Benjamin Netanyahu, where he was basically saying that he had no regard for Qatar and didn't consider them to be any better than the UN and so on. And this was an interesting story for a couple of reasons to me, but I just wanted, did you guys think much of this story? Alejandro, did it strike you in any way?
Well, not really. I don't have a lot of things to say about that, except that I think the reaction of the media about certain things that are obvious are not helping at all in the climate of today's world, which is essentially people with common sense have the notion that our leaders are hiding something. And I don't think they're hiding anything. I just think that they are extremely evasive, if that word exists. They evade anything that comes into their mind, or everything that spurts into reality, and therefore anything that they sound or say sounds extremely weird or not trying to tackle the issues. And is Qatar really bad? Yes, definitely. It's as worse as the UN, maybe worse, because you only have Qatar against some better countries that are in the UN. So saying that Qatar is not a awful country that is hosting people that planned the murders of the 7th of October, it's really crazy. In the same way that the media is saying that, complaining that Biden had said behind closed doors that she was a dictator. I mean, come on.
Yeah, it was the comparison with China with Biden there was the one that particularly came to mind for me with this one. And just, I guess, particularly the exact quote, which was released by Israel's Channel 12 News, was Netanyahu saying to the to the hostages' families, "You don't hear me thanking Qatar. Have you noticed why? Because for me, it is essentially no different from the UN or the Red Cross, and in a certain sense, even more problematic. I have no illusions about them, but I'm ready to use any actor right now that helps me bring the hostages home." So that's the particular quote that was so outrageous to the Qatari foreign ministry. Mark and Richard, did you guys think anything about this?
Well, I mean, it's shocking news. Islamic guy thinks the Israeli guy is terrible. Wow, hold your breath. I mean, the problem is that most of the Middle East, the constant common value in the Middle East is their religion, and it's their religion that they appeal to when they throw a rocket into Israel. They don't shout "Long live Palestine." They shout "Allahu Akbar," and that defines the whole block, that defines the whole area. And of course, anyone who's not part of that particular club is going to be the enemy. And we've seen it for the last 75, 76 years. So there's nothing new there. And Qatar, I mean, is sheltering the leaders of the government who's caused the attack October 7th. So why should Netanyahu think any better of them? Qatar is effectively right now representing the UN, represents a position that UN is taking against Israel. You know, it's quite obvious that the same culture pervading the UN is the culture that comes from the kind of area. But certainly, the UN is very much in favor, as friendly to the kind of culture. So you can't expect any different from Netanyahu.
To what extent have countries like Qatar in the beginning even come out against strongly enough against the taking of hostages in the first place, and criticizing Hamas and the Palestinian people for firing rockets into Israel, etc., and for all of the events of October 7th? If they then later on want credit for the appeasement, or credit for the diplomacy, or credit for the grey compromise with evil that enables you to release those hostages, then you're just asking for the good to compromise at every single level, aren't you? And to succeed at more high ground in terms of what's the best position to take at every stage. And that's quite despicable and uncomfortable, to say the least. I think when it comes to trying to rate countries in terms of their relative awfulness within the same key culture, that again is somewhat pointless, isn't it? I mean, obviously, you're going to rate the Hamas murderers of October 7th and all the activities they performed as the very worst of humanity imaginable, and somebody dressed as a piece of royalty in Qatar is going to be in a different category, even though their how they behave is adding to the whole picture anyway, and what they're supporting and enabling to spread across the Islamic world is all relevant to the big picture. But taking a list of countries and expecting you to give some credit to some for being less evil is stupid.
Yes, and I guess what struck me about the story is kind of along the lines of what Alejandro was saying, is that there's something about Western diplomacy particularly where we're very afraid about calling out an evil person in the clear light of day. So with the example with Xi Jinping in China, Biden was chastised, I think it was by Blinken, for having called Xi a dictator. I can't remember whether that was on stage or whether that was in a back room or something. But in some context, he had described Xi Jinping as being a dictator, something which is obviously true, which is a state of being that Xi Jinping's worked very hard to achieve for a number of years, and which no one is under any illusions about. The fact that China still has a kind of parliamentary chamber or whatever you would actually call it is completely irrelevant. He holds, dictatorial power over the country, and everybody knows that. And yet, actually identifying them as such is viewed as this tremendous problem. And in the same way with the Qataris here, the fact that Netanyahu was disparaging about them, one of the other parts of the comments was he said that they're financiers of Hamas. This is regarded as this kind of huge problem. Now, of course, the Qataris themselves are going to say, "Oh, how terrible and irresponsible of Netanyahu to say this." But then what was interesting is you get this flurry in the Western media and amongst Western leaders about how, well, that was a real misstep that Netanyahu made there. He was irresponsible in some way for having done that. Except if we get it to where we have to sort of lie to ourselves about the nature of these terrible regimes and say it only in private meetings or something like that, or ignore the fact that Qatar is harboring the leadership of this group, which is which wants to go out and just kill Israelis, which is that's their stated goal in life. Then what kind of position are we in? So that was the main thing that struck me about this story. And I guess, I don't know, how do we end up changing? I mean, and when did we get to this position? Like, when did we get to the position where Western leaders feel like they have to they can't really say it. They can't really say it too loudly about the awful dictators in the world whom we associate with, and how can we kind of change it? Maybe it's a deep kind of cultural change that we need to have about self-assertiveness, about kind of moral priorities. I don't know, but Alejandro, any thoughts?
Well, I think your question is extremely big, and maybe it will require us to go through a whole week of explaining it. But my impression is that it resides on two related things. One, multiculturalism, which says, don't you judge other cultures, and which sometimes says there are better cultures than yours, so shut up, and don't be so certain that you are holding the right values of your country. And the other one, which is historical, and maybe there were some committed sins, is the issue of colonialism, which essentially says the West did horrible things in the past, so it shouldn't be so intermissive, or it shouldn't try to intervene so much in other countries' policies. So I think if you want to combat that, first of all, we need a good, objective analysis of what happened during colonialism, but also we should object and think that multiculturalism is wrong.
Yeah. And since the end of the Second World War, really, the West has begun what eventually will culminate into the Kissinger school of diplomacy, where you do everything in order to appease everyone, and you never stand up for a single value, because there's always a deal to be made. I mean, in a way, it feels a bit like Trump in charge, doesn't it? The problem here is also Netanyahu. What troubles me is Netanyahu being willing to somewhat make a deal with Qatar, even in the name of freeing hostages. Well, if you go down the route, it's been proven over and over and over again that if you do that, you just give them Hamas and whoever supports them, Iran, all those countries, to effectively to do the same all over again. And you will never achieve a peace like everybody seems to want by not fighting back, by not making clear, if you step out of line, you're going to be destroyed. If you dare threatening our citizens, if you dare going against our value, trampling all over individual freedom, you will pay for it dearly, and you'll never be able to do it ever again. But we don't make the point. And so these countries who don't have values, but they're quite happy to destroy the little values we've left with, they take advantage of it. They take advantage of our own techniques, or the stuff that we, if you like, we learn to deal with each other without necessarily having a legislation. We used to have a gentleman agreement. We used to understand certain rules, that you don't step beyond a certain line because you step on somebody else's toes. Those things are all totally gone out of the window. And now we are paying the consequences for not making it clear this is a line. Just look at Obama. Sets a red line, they trample all over it, and nothing happens. Well, what do you expect? You just training them to be worse and worse, to push the line further and further in.
The problem is the myopic, short-sighted focus on these hostages, as opposed to the hostages of the future, the people in all sorts of countries all over the world that you've now earmarked to be hostages because the strategy can be successful as a means for getting what you want, as can terrorism generally. That's what you're establishing with your repeated pragmatism and short-term thinking. And I think it's also the refusal to name your enemy for who they are covers the broader picture here, isn't it? The refusal to say what you stand for and therefore who your enemy is, and to make you all in the same muddy mess in the middle, and nobody's quite sure who's got which ideals. That's a key part of the problem. I think there's a domestic example of what you're talking about going on at the moment with a little news story to do with calling people evil, for example. I mean, there were two students and another guy who were murdered on the streets of Britain in the middle of the night by somebody who suddenly knifed them out of the blue. And the BBC seems to be more horrified at the fact that that guy, now convicted and being sent to a mental institution, is being referred to as evil, than the fact that three people were killed in cold-blooded murder. Again, that just exposes where your moral thinking is at. You're always trying to make excuses. You're always trying to muddy the water. You're always trying to excuse the enemy and blame the good for having principles and ideals in the first place. And this is where it leads you to ending up praising a mass murderer on the small scale or the larger scale.
I think that example is pretty good, because I guess at the root of a lot of it is the reluctance to judge morally. So the reluctance to pronounce this guy as evil, and then the reluctance to pronounce Xi Jinping as a dictator, or to condemn Qatar, basically.
Suppose if you start pointing finger to the bad people and say this is a bad guy, then you'll be forced to say I'm standing for this and that, and nobody has any clue nowadays what they stand for, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah,
and that's what altruism is a cover for in the end, half the time, isn't it? It's a cover for the fact that people don't have principles and are scared of morality generally, so they adopt this morality that can cover up the fact that they don't know what they think or why they think it or where they're going.
And perhaps it's also a sheepishness from our leaders in the sense that they kind of know that they are morally flawed as well. And if you start pronouncing judgments, if you're condemnatory, then you invite reprisals onto yourself, because moral principles do require a lot of you. They require a lot of consistency, and our leaders are inconsistent all over the shop. Okay. So we only have a few minutes left, and we do have another story, but I don't know, maybe we don't quite have enough time to do it justice. I don't know. Do you guys have anything to say about this? So the final, should we go for the final story? Yeah.
If you like, yeah, sure.
Sure. Okay. So this is that two Israeli government ministers are promoting a conference, which is being patronized by a lot of the political community in Israel. And this is a conference which is concerned with reestablishing settlements in Gaza after the cessation of conflict in Gaza in the near future. Particularly, the tagline of the conference is "Only settlement will bring security." And this is something which is obviously hugely kind of inflammatory to the international community, who are very much opposed to Israeli settlements, the ones which already exist in the West Bank, and very much have voiced that they're opposed to the resettlement or the reestablishing of any settlements in Gaza after the war. And exactly what the Israeli plan is for Gaza after the war has been a very contentious topic as well. So what do you guys think? One, either just about this conference, or what do you think about the international community's reaction to the idea that Israel should reestablish settlements? Do you think it's reasonable that Israel do that? Do you think it's not reasonable? And so on. What do you guys think? Alejandro, we can come to you if you like, or whoever.
Just to say briefly, I think that Israel should first win the war, then it should think what it's going to do next. Whatever you do, maybe you will have a range of good things to do, but first you have to win the war. And if you don't win it, if you don't allow yourself to look victorious upon its enemy, then nothing you do, no matter how well or how well reasoned your ideas are, it won't work. So do I oppose, or do I think that a settlement is a good idea? I would say I don't know. I think that's related more to the military theory that I'm certainly not a theoretician about, and I don't know about. But what I do know is that Israel should focus right now on winning the war.
Yeah, well, I mean, we had settlement in Gaza before, didn't we? And then how did that end up? How peaceful that was. And there's only one solution here. Israel totally destroys Hamas and its supporters, possibly, and then starts re-educating the people in Gaza who've been clearly brainwashed. And then, in 20, 30, 40 years time, they can start looking at a different solution. But right now, the only solution, as Alejandro said, keep pushing in, get rid of the threat, get rid of Hamas, and control the situation like that.
Yeah, I mean, aren't you in danger here of adopting the level of thinking of Tal, who we started this program by discussing? I mean, you're effectively taking his fact that there are people that use from the river to the sea to mean the genocide of Jews inside Israel, and choosing to forget about it the second after. I mean, you've seen how lots of the things that are proposed as solutions, whether it's land exchanged for peace back in 2005 and the disengagement from Gaza as being the ideal solution, and then everything will be fine and everyone will live happily and whatever, and which ignores the fact that then rockets were fired continually from Gaza into Israel. So it's almost, to me, it's saying the same as Tal, in the sense that there's no military solution. We're just going to do a bit of this and a bit of that, and it'll just work this time because why? Because we've evaded every fact that's relevant, which includes the fact that you need to change the culture, that you need to change the attitude of those that live there before you're even going to get anywhere near being able to live in a peace thereafter, in whatever form, and who lives where and which buildings are built where and all that kind of stuff is all secondary to that initial concern.
And so, and just for context for people, Richard's referring, or Marco was saying there were settlements before. I think there was about 8,000 Jews who used to live in settlements in the Gaza Strip, and then were removed in 2005 to make way for the Land for Peace deal. I guess since we don't have much time, I'll just summarize at one point very briefly, is that I guess we need to see some kind of consistency from the Israeli government on this. And this is an area where they're a bit unclear, or maybe their answers are a bit unsatisfactory about what exactly the future of Gaza is going to look like. And I agree with your point, Alejandro, that completely the more important and pressing business is that they need to get on with winning it. But there does need to be some kind of direction about what exactly is going to happen. And Netanyahu has kind of said things about they're going to assume a security responsibility and stuff like that. But there seems to be some suggestions that, or not even suggestions, but it's not exactly clear what level of involvement actually there's going to be. There was this proposed plan from, I want to say, was it Gantz or so on, which was this 3 or 4 stage plan. I think it might actually be beneficial to Israel if we saw something much more concrete in terms of their planning of what was going to be going on. And if it's going to be resettlement, I don't particularly have a problem with that per se, although that's very controversial. But there needs to be a clear answer. So in lieu of looking at the time, I'll stop there. But I think that's something that we could do as thing. Anything final, guys, before we sign off?
I think I would just add that you need to fill in every single one of those tunnels and destroy them first before you even consider who lives on the land on top.
Even that, you don't get out the situation where the culture all around you is poised to kill you. So, even that is not going to help anyway.
Yeah, there's definitely those sort of more pressing and fundamental issues too. All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining me, and thanks everyone for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with the reality show and the daily objective. I think basically what we're talking about on both shows is going to be the International Court of Justice ruling on the case brought by South Africa about genocide. Certainly we're talking about it on the daily objective, and I think we're going to be talking about that on the reality show too. So hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow, and that's going to be a contentious topic as well, but we'll see you all then. So thank you so much.
Bye.